Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. My name is Joshua Gonzalez, and I am the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And I am delighted to be joined today by Ms. Simone Petrella, as well as Ms. Mihoko Matsubara, who will moderate today's discussion. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to take care of. First, I'd like to remind you all that today's session is on the record and will be recorded. There will also be English and Japanese simultaneous interpretation. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen, you can select the language that you would like to use to listen to today's session. Captioning for today's program is also available through the UD Talk app or in your web browser. Instructions for connecting were sent out prior to today's event, and they can also be found in the chat box. Also, I'd like to remind you all that today's speaker is not an employee of the US government, so her remarks and expertise do not represent the official policy of the US government. Following the opening remarks and presentations, we will open up our session for questions and answers. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can submit your questions anonymously, both in Japanese and in English. Additionally, during today's program, we will be conducting some audience polling here in a minute, and we encourage you to participate. This will help give the speaker a better idea of you all's knowledge about today's topic. This is also completely anonymous, so we encourage you to participate. So without further ado, I would like to invite you all to engage with us in some audience polling questions. You should see questions pop up on your screen now. Please take a moment to answer those. All right, so thank you so much for answering our polling questions. In terms of the first question regarding how prepared you think Japan is to face current cybersecurity threats, the majority of you said that you were mostly unprepared, which is in part why we're having this session and why we have invited such a great speaker to speak about these cybersecurity issues here today. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator for today's session. Ms. Mihoko Matsubara is Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation in Tokyo and is responsible for cybersecurity and thought leadership. She served at the Japanese Ministry of Defense before her MA at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies on a Fulbright scholarship. Prior to joining NTT, she worked as VP and Public Sector Chief Security Officer for Asia Pacific at Palo Alto Networks. She served on the Japanese government's Cybersecurity R&D Policy Committee between 2014 and 2018. She is an adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum in Honolulu and an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, London. She published a book on cybersecurity in Japanese in 2019, which won an award by the Okawa Foundation for Information and Telecommunications in 2020. So without further ado, pass it over to you, Matsubara-san. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Thank you for having me. So it's my great honor to introduce Ms. Simone Pereira. So let me introduce her bio. So Simone Pereira is CEO and co-founder of CyberVista. Previously, Simone was a senior associate at Booz Allen Hamilton, where she helped build the firm's cybersecurity practice in the commercial sector, focusing on the creation of cyber fusion centers and the integration of cyber threat intelligence, security operations, and cyber defense operations into effective cybersecurity operations. For a decade, she led the firm's also cyber threat intelligence business in the national security and defense sectors, where she built out a threat capability and team with in-depth subject matter expertise in all aspects of cyber threat intelligence, including intelligence support to both defensive and offensive operations. Her areas of specialty included predictive cyber intelligence based on an understanding of the threat adversary and developing service offerings to integrate intelligence into exercises to provide realistic cyber scenarios. Simone received her JD with honors from Catholic University's Columbus School of Law and graduated from Georgetown University with a BA in government and an MA in international law and policy. She is a member of Women in International Security and is admitted to the New York Bar. A native of New Jersey, she has resided in Washington, D.C. since 2000. So her topic, cybersecurity talent development, is so important and more important than ever, given the fact that 7% of global GDP was lost by cybercrime, including ransomware attacks back in 2000. So this is huge. And we face acute shortage of good cybersecurity professionals. So she's sharing her insights of our challenges with the shortage of cybersecurity talents and how we can upskill our talents. So I really look forward to hearing Simone's expertise today. So Simone, over to you.
Thank you so much, Go. Appreciate it. Let me take a minute and share my screen. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to talk to you today about upskilling the cyber workforce and developing talent. As Mihoko very adeptly said, the talent shortage is one of the three primary areas that the US and we have continued to focus on as we think about really trying to solve the cybersecurity challenge. But to kick things off, when we talk about talent, I'd like to frame the problem in terms of how it actually is reflected within the United States. And it comes down to a simple mismatch of supply and demand. So in the United States currently, there are over 1 million people employed in cybersecurity jobs today. And yet we still have almost 600,000 jobs that are unfilled because we don't have enough qualified talent to fill them. To put that kind of need and demand into perspective, if we were to take any university, community college training program that we have in the United States and take all the graduates from it tomorrow and put them in the workforce immediately, it would still not solve the problem. And a lot of the attempts in artificial intelligence and technology to automate those tasks still doesn't eliminate the need for qualified cybersecurity workforce. So the volume of the problem in the US and across the globe is significant. Now, I do want to take a step back and address how did we get here, because the context is important. And the genesis of this challenge for us is kind of a factor of a number of things. The first is that, this shortage has actually existed since the inception of cybersecurity as a field. And as many of you may be aware, what we define in today's modern time as cybersecurity actually has its roots in a field called information assurance and data protection, which, at least in the US, were largely within the purview of the Department of Defense. Now, those functions, as far as the initial responsibility for cybersecurity, was meant to protect information. If you think back to the advent of the internet communications, how things are actually networked, they are built on trust and the fact that things could actually be shared openly. That obviously is in direct contrast with governments and organizations looking to actually maintain security over those things. So prior, and I'm going to mark 2007 as the watershed moment here, prior to 2007, as a starting point, the United States didn't even have a common definition of what cybersecurity was or what those roles entailed. In fact, even today, the definition of cybersecurity varies slightly between agencies, services, and organizations. But what happened in 2007 was the advent of something in the United States called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. And it was a nationally recognized effort to prioritize cybersecurity across the government domain. What happened was that recognition through that initiative realized that we, even in the US government, didn't have an actual way to define, title, and assign cyber work that was particularly specialized. We didn't even have a good inventory of the government. So as an example, when I say that the development of cybersecurity has become much more multifaceted and multidisciplinary, there are jobs in cybersecurity that exist today. An example is something like in threat hunting that did not exist 5 years ago. The landscape is changing quickly. There are people that did those types of tasks back in the day, or even as far back as 2007, but it wasn't defined as its own role. And so the amount of just sheer job roles that have kind of evolved since this point has really expanded significantly. The second thing I just want to point to, it's the last bullet here, are kind of the roots of the cybersecurity world, which actually has a lot of its genesis in hacker culture. And hacker culture really was a counterculture, meaning it was meant to be a way to actually kind of root against the advent of centralized technology. They were fighting for open internet, for open ways that they could actually tinker with things. And that very cultural underpinning has been a very interesting pull in the challenge to attract more talent into the field, because it isn't necessarily one that had met the mainstream when it was first developed. So that has just made it harder to get more people into the field. The last thing that has kind of contributed to the challenge in the United States is as this industry has been formed, defined, and shaped over the years, we have had a patchwork of different credentials and degrees and ways that we're trying to actually peg success of what someone looks like to be a qualified cybersecurity professional, but it is incredibly individualized, it's very privatized, and so as a result, we don't have one common definition. To illustrate the point, I have some stats over here on the right. There are over 260 universities in the United States that teach cyber defense. And those are just universities accredited by the NSA's Academic Centers of Excellence. More than about 150 universities then have programs that teach offensive cyber skills. And to further complicate the landscape, you can look to achieve more than 85 different certifications, training courses, or courses specific to cybersecurity in the market today. And why is this important to kind of set up? It's because it's created a large disconnect between organizations that are looking to bring on talent and secure their environments, and then the individual talent that's looking to kind of get into the field. Because typically when you have a supply and demand problem like we have here, the talent or the supply starts to really kind of, everyone wants to kind of come into the into the fray in order to meet the demand need that the market has set. In this case, the disconnect kind of comes in because employers are still struggling, even in the US, to identify and hire the right cyber talent. And they do this for a few reasons. One, there is a bias in the United States to say, we are looking for someone who has maybe an entry-level position, but the job requisitions will still be written in a way where they require 5 years of experience. So employers are looking for experienced candidates and are almost always looking for experienced candidates. While if you look at the candidate side, where you start to grow pipeline and new candidates, they're maybe getting a degree or a certification, but they haven't had an opportunity to gain the real world experience yet. And so they're not getting a chance in the job market because employers are only looking for that experienced, sophisticated talent. This has kind of created one of the things that we see in the private sector in the United States in particular, where there is a push to kind of provide a perspective to invest in entry-level talent, because at some point, the only way you get experienced talent is to steal it from another company. And then you're paying usually anywhere between a 10% and plus salary premium to actually kind of get that new outside talent in the door. But so a very kind of illustrative point of just where the problem is and why we've made it there today. So when we think about solutions, the way I'd like to frame this is to kind of run through some of the things that have been done on the government side in the United States as we think about anchoring on how to approach talent. The first one is in the idea of anchoring in a common lexicon. If you recall, I said that there, at the time in 2007 and even today, there is not one standard definition of what it means to say cybersecurity. That gets compounded when you try and define the actual job functions and roles that people who do security work are actually performing. So in 2008, there was actually a mandate through the United States government, through an organization called the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It's commonly known as NIST. And they established the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, or NICE, as a fundamental resource to describe and share information about cybersecurity work roles. I think it's important to note that prior to the NICE initiative being established, the US government did not have a way to fully define and assess cybersecurity roles itself. So this was started as something that the government was using to define its own work roles. And NIST tasked the NICE initiative to create a standard framework to understand cybersecurity roles within the federal government. And the first version of this work was published in 2012 and then was made public and put out to both private sector, academia, industry, and government in a second version in 2014, and it has been revised ever since. So it is a continual revision document that exists today. The goal of it was to create a common way to talk about job roles. We can go into a bit more depth on this, but one thing I will kind of note is one of the challenges when you talk about defining the work of cybersecurity is that it depends on your organization how broad or how narrow or specialized that work is. So for a lexicon like this, for example, the US government defines 52 different work roles that one could perform across anything in cybersecurity. So you can imagine how much detail goes into kind of each of those work roles, and then you translate that into smaller organizations that don't have that large of security personnel or teams. It becomes a bit of a difficult translation between something very specialized and narrow to try and apply it across the board. but it at least has started the conversation to actually get everyone on the same page. And one thing we have seen over the last few years, since it was first released to the public in the United States in 2014, is year over year increased adoption of not only government agencies, but also the private sector, academia, and industry following the NICE framework as a way to kind of talk about things in a way that we know we're referring to the same work, the same roles, the same titles. The next thing I would like to point out on kind of government and NGO initiatives are really categorically around building pipeline. And one of the things that we see across the efforts to really increase the talent pool is to focus on building out the candidates so that we have more individuals who could fill these roles. And that pipeline is often accomplished through a number of different initiatives, and they're all very small in relative scale, but they exist across all government agencies with very few exceptions. So internship programs, apprenticeships, there is a large push right now in the United States to have apprenticeship programs across the board within federal government, and cybersecurity is no exception. There are also government-led conferences and initiatives to provide resources and perspective for our kindergarten through 12. So that's our primary school education system for children as young as 6 all the way through high school or 18 years old, to incorporate cybersecurity and computer science education into their programs. And then lastly, there are a number of nonprofits, for instance, cyber.org, that provide additional resources to bring that curriculum into the pipeline of talent. Now, as I said right in the beginning of my presentation, if we were to take kind of everyone that was available today and stick them into available work roles, we still would actually have a fairly significant deficit. And so the core of the challenge, or the core of one of the issues of these types of programs, is not that they're inherently good or bad. They're actually wonderful. We need to focus on building pipeline talent all the way from the very beginning, but it doesn't help us solve the problem as it exists today. So then you have to look at, well, what do we do to actually fill the gap that exists right now when we have such a major cybersecurity risk at play? The last thing I want to focus on, and these are actually quite new, are some government-led efforts within individual agencies to try and continue to attract and be more competitive when it comes to competing for cyber talent, because the US government is now also itself competing with the private sector for high-level experienced talent, because the salaries and the demand is just so great. So the Department of Defense has had a longstanding program called the Cyber Accepted Service Personnel System that allows for direct hiring into the government. It is typically a very long bureaucratic process. This helps bypass and expedite it. And the Department of Homeland Security just launched a cyber talent management system, which not only includes components for direct hiring as well as competitive salaries that rival what individuals are getting in the private sector, but also is building in competency-based assessments to allow for more accurate hiring, to make sure that people have the skills that they really need to do the job. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to now touch on some of the things that the private sector is doing. All of these things are happening in kind of parallel with each other. So the private sector is also focused on how they can build and create their own pipeline. And they do that through apprenticeship programs. There are a number of large companies that work with organizations. An example is an organization called Year Up that actually identifies underrepresented talent in areas that are completely unrelated to cybersecurity or anything else, and they put them through a 6-month program to make them qualified to serve in roles, and then place them in partner private sector companies that they work with. And we're also seeing a rise of cyber internships within the private sector as well. But really, outside of the commitments the private sector is making, the biggest thing that is happening in the private sector regarding the talent shortage and how to address that is a shift toward prioritizing cyber talent as a security strategy. So having been a former consultant myself, I talk a lot in my past about the important things to have a cybersecurity program are to make sure that you have strong representation of your people, process, and your technology. Unfortunately, the cyber industry has probably over-relied on technology as a response as we have continued to try and protect and defend networks. And we have started to recognize process and the focus on people as a component of that security strategy has often been just a taken for granted component of the strategy. But companies are waking up to the fact that even if you have all the best technology and you've automated everything that you possibly can, you still have to ultimately rely on a human somewhere in the chain to be able to synthesize, make sense of data, chase down false positives, and really do the work appropriately. And so some of the more sophisticated companies in the United States are really looking to prioritize and invest in their cyber talent strategies in that people layer. And they're doing that in a number of ways. The first is that they're aligning work functions and competencies to roles. What I mean by that is they're actually looking at the job and the work that's being done and defining what the actual role is that's being accomplished so that they can have a better job description, they can have better sense of what work needs to be done and who are the types of people that need to fill them. The second thing that some cutting edge companies are doing is starting to leverage data and metrics to inventory and baseline the existing cybersecurity teams that they have so that they can understand where do they have areas of strength and how does that align to roles that they need them to fill, or where are there gaps in their knowledge or skills, and then that can help prioritize training investments and things that need to be filled by either additional personnel or anything else. So identifying those kind of functional skill gaps within the cybersecurity teams as they exist today is a very important starting point as these companies are building out their strategies. And then the last piece is once you know what you have and where you want to go, you have to build out a cybersecurity training program beyond what's just happening in the pipeline to help you meet those goals. And the reality is that there is not a one-stop solution to build that program out. And so companies are working to understand what do they have in-house that they've developed to make to kind of incorporate these programs, what third-party vendors do they use, depending on what the needs are, and other resources to put together a solution that works for them. And last, but certainly not least, the private sector is definitely focused, as well as the government, in ongoing talent development. So how do you not only kind of identify and hire this talent and get them into the right jobs, but how do you retain them and how do you continue that investment in skills training over time so that there are actual career paths and ways that people can progress within the field. But what I don't want to leave out are some of the interesting initiatives that exist in the United States around public and private partnerships, because ultimately cybersecurity is a problem that we are grappling with together. It is no longer just a national security issue, and it's not just a nuisance within the private sector as well. And so what I want to point out in some of these are first, an initiative called the Cyber Talent Initiative in the United States. There is a group called the Partnership for Public Service, and they have a goal to recruit and train a cybersecurity workforce that actually gains experience both in the public and the private sector. So an interesting concept when you think about a public-private partnership, in this case, the US government and its agencies have committed to identifying and hiring talent to serve in agency roles for 2 years. At the conclusion of their 2 years in federal service, they are eligible to be hired by the initiative's corporate partners. So there are corporate private sector companies who have kind of signed up with this. And if they are hired by the private sector company, at the end of it, the candidate is actually given a significant incentive through student loan forgiveness on their educational loans. And so the idea here being that the federal government and the private sector is acknowledging that they can work together to actually not only place, but get talent, the experience they need to serve in other roles, while also creating an environment where those kinds of individuals might cycle in and out of the public-private sector for their whole careers moving forward. The second thing that I want to notice, or at least point out here, is that especially in the current Biden administration, there is a tremendous amount of power that the White House has to convene different groups together. And so in August of this year, they actually hosted a meeting with public sector, private sector, and education leaders specifically to address the cybersecurity talent issue. And coming out of that, not only does it elevate the national narrative around the importance of the issue, but it also helps propel a lot of companies, especially in the US, to make commitments, public commitments, to act on how they are going to contribute to solving the cybersecurity talent problem. Two other things I'd like to point out: there's also the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which hosts working groups that brings together experts from industry, government, and academia to tackle a whole host of cybersecurity issues in addition. And then there are the National Centers of Academic Excellence, which actually is a program run out of the National Security Agency, and it aims to create and manage a collaborative cybersecurity educational program with community colleges, full-term colleges, and universities, so that they have some kind of comparative basis for cybersecurity degree programs. I will pause here to say that in aggregate, all of these initiatives across government, private sector, the public-private partnership initiatives are wonderful initiatives, and they have each done tremendous things to help continue to get more visibility into the issue and more candidates into the pipeline. But in aggregate, one of the things that they do fall victim to, all of them, is that it is very easy to fall into the trap of these all being smaller scale initiatives. And so the high cost of maintenance of developing these programs for only a very few amount of candidates that come out of here can be very difficult. And so what I'd like to kind of transition into is we think about what initiatives work within the context of Japan and its challenges with cybersecurity and cyber talent, is to talk about some strategic best practices that I urge everyone to consider when actually addressing the cyber talent shortage overall. So please take all those initiatives we just discussed into account, but like to kind of hit a little bit here. So the first recommendation is to take control of where you invest in cybersecurity training. And that means by doing it smartly. Most organizations, at least in the US, determine where they're making training investments in people by allowing employees to select their own training based on their interest or by request. Now, that has a place, and it's good for employee retention and morale in some instances, but what rarely happens is it rarely results in an employee that has direct training that can be brought back to make them better at their job. And so if organizations can be deliberate in identifying where they have skill gap needs, where they actually need to have people filling certain roles, then you can be deliberate and efficient about driving training to the organization's needs to actually affect overall security, as opposed to only being a retention incentive or something that is good for employee morale. Some of the best organizations that I've had the honor to work with have done this in combination, where they take a snapshot of what the organization needs as far as what the training profile looks like as they think about each role. And then they will meet with the individual employees to understand where they want to go, and then essentially come up with a plan of what that training for that employee will look like in their long-term professional development plan. The second recommendation that I think is a strategic best practice is to understand what you need for the job. And what I mean when I say that is you cannot evaluate if your cybersecurity teams have the right competencies for the jobs that they're doing if you don't truly understand the role and what it needs. And that means understanding at the job task level what the breakdown is of what it means to be something like a SOC analyst versus a threat analyst versus roles that are in governance, risk, or compliance, because those skill profiles are different. And so it's important to establish a baseline of those expected outcomes for those different roles, because that becomes the threshold by which you can actually measure people against. If you don't do that work up front, then you are essentially flying blind and just hoping that you can put together the right combination of people to meet what you need to do. This is also important later when we talk about how you think about training and where you can actually build more of this talent internally, because understanding this kind of profile of a role and what it means for the skills also allows you to focus on the training areas that you do need most for those roles, rather than taking a blanket, everyone has to go through a very robust, time-intensive program that takes them away from critical cybersecurity work. The third recommendation that I'd like to leave everyone with is this idea of using data and metrics to inform training spend and strategic direction. So at the end of the day, you cannot improve what you don't measure. And there are some incredible opportunities today to actually assess and provide cybersecurity leaders with the data to make smarter decisions around talent development, training, hiring, all kinds of things. And so understanding by if you can quantitatively collect where people are at, and in this case, peg it against a standard, then you can take that data and understand, where do you have gaps in your program based on the skills of your people? Where do you have appropriate coverage? Or is it not the individual level, but if you understand that the whole team overall gives you the coverage that you need across defense or security, engineering, and operations, then you should feel fairly good about your security program. It also allows you to kind of verify the competencies you have for specific roles. So it's a really important kind of data point that can help you not only figure out, can you kind of validate what you've determined the roles are, but then you can start doing some really creative things as you think about looking internally, and I'll talk about this for a minute, on where there's other talent in your organization that you could cross-skill and bring into cybersecurity roles without waiting for a new pipeline of talent. So that leads me to my next point around upskilling and cross-skilling non-traditional sources of talent. I mentioned at the beginning that organizations and agencies are all on a rush for the most experienced cybersecurity talent that ultimately does not exist. The pool is not getting big enough fast enough. But what is happening is there are a large subset of employees in agencies, in private sector companies across the industry that are responsible for cybersecurity tasks, even when they are not necessarily cybersecurity professionals. And so it's not only the multidisciplinary nature of the field that's continued to create this highly technical field of IT people that do security, or governance and policy people that need to know security, but it's also important to think about the pools of talent that you already have in your organizations that could actually be not primarily responsible for information security, but have security responsibilities as part of their roles. And that's important for a number of reasons. One, having a more security, not only aware, but competent workforce doing information technology functions, networking functions will help alleviate some of the pressure on the actual cybersecurity personnel, but it also allows you to take existing institutional knowledge that might exist within your organization and bring them into security roles. And a lot of times, I see this all the time, a lot of times the most useful experience that organizations are looking for is not only 20 years of cybersecurity experience, but someone that has institutional knowledge of the organization. Do they understand what they are ultimately trying to protect? And there are people within the organization that often have that institutional knowledge and are only looking for a chance to be given that kind of ladder into a cybersecurity role. And so companies that are looking inside their own organizations to say, do we have existing personnel that we could make into cybersecurity professionals, actually do quite well, because you're giving people a retention pathway, you're giving them career upward potential, and you're maintaining, as the organization, you're maintaining that institutional knowledge that there is no way to bypass just years of experience in kind of learning an organization and its crown jewels and its critical business functions. The next recommendation that I have is around investing and take the long-term strategy to hire and onboard more entry-level talent. We are not going to solve this problem in the United States or across the globe if we only think that we can develop experience level talent from the get-go. So when deployed wisely, and it's always wisely, investing and growing in your own talent as an organization and not only relying on a pipeline of talent from university systems is a good way to augment, not only a way to expedite the talent gap in solving that problem, but also can be more cost effective and efficient, especially for a world like in the United States where the salary requirements for existing cybersecurity talent are so high that it can be cost prohibitive for some companies to hire good talent because they can't afford it. So in many ways, investing in a training plan to grow talent over time can be less dollars in the yearly spend in investments in training and what you put them through in programs than if you were to actually have to recruit and hire that kind of that existing cybersecurity professional from the get-go. So I think there's really a cost savings element here too, if it's done properly in not only the training spend, but also the wages. And again, if you couple that with the idea of giving people or looking internally, you can really identify some diamonds in the rough within your organization that can accelerate things. The last thing, as far as recommendations, are then kind of the follow-on. If you're going to invest in entry-level talent, but this is true in all talent, is think about what are the career paths that can be developed once you have that talent in your organization. So if they're starting at entry level, what are the things that they need to accumulate in experience, in training, in perspective to go from that first level role to something in the mid-level role? And how do they transition? How do they get there? Do you get them there through upskilling and training? Perhaps. Do you get them there through some rotational job programs within your organization? Also perhaps. But understanding how your organization can actually have a pipeline of its own people go from starting point through their careers is incredibly important. Because when I talk about the multidisciplinary state of cybersecurity jobs, it can be very difficult for people to understand how to advance when the jobs are changing so rapidly and they hit a ceiling quickly. So organizations, it's in their best interest to show their own staff and employees how they can actually get from point A to point B to point C, because it gives them an actual ambition and roadmap to achieve within that own organization. So with those recommendations, I will conclude. Thank you so much for everything. I will turn it back because I know we have some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Simone. And I really appreciate your deep insights of the comprehensive overview of the challenges we face in terms of the acute shortage of cybersecurity talents, but also you shared practical advice on how to hire entry level of cybersecurity people, next generations, but also how to take advantage of our existing talent by upskilling and also cross-skilling cybersecurity talents and human resources. So I'd like to encourage everyone who is listening to this webinar to post your Q&A questions in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, before we receive the first batch of the questions, I'd like to take advantage of my position as a moderator to ask a question to Simone. So Simone, because I noticed that your background is on legal and also policy, I'm very curious now how you started to develop your interest in cybersecurity career path and how you yourself actually upskilled and cross-skilled your legal and policy background and cybersecurity skills.
Yeah, I think part of my bias when I look at the state of the cybersecurity landscape today is definitely informed by my own path into cybersecurity. You are correct. I have an international relations, a legal, and a policy background. I actually started my career not in anything technical at all. I went to work for the Department of Defense as a civilian, predominantly doing international relations and intelligence work. And what I learned quickly is in 2005, I had an opportunity to work in the DoD intelligence community. And I originally started doing counterterrorism in computer network operations. And because it was within the intelligence community, our charter was not only to look at technical topics, but we were looking at what adversaries are out there and what intent, motivations, and tactics, techniques, and capabilities do they have to impact the US from a national security perspective. So no, I don't have a technical background, but what I did have was an analytic background. I was, being trained as an attorney and being in policy, I understood analytic thinking, critical thinking, how to evaluate an assessment. And those soft skills on communication were, I'd say, more helpful to me in making the transition into translating that into technical material than if I had only been, say, an engineer or something else. But as far as my own upskilling, it was, like many people who have been in my role now today and peers that I've had, it was on-the-job training. It was ad hoc courses that I took throughout my tenure and my career, and a lot of trial and error. But I'll say beyond my own path, I'd say some of the most brilliant information security officers and security executives I've worked with come from very diverse backgrounds, music degrees, journalism degrees, history degrees. So I do think we have a little bit of a disconnect where we want to immediately now say everyone needs a cybersecurity degree, when that diversity of background actually makes a really strong cybersecurity professional.
Thank you, Simone, for sharing your personal journey to become a cybersecurity expert. So now I have one question in Japanese. So should I read out in Japanese first?
The question was typed in English in the chat box if you want to just read it from there.
Oh, okay. So thank you. So while people are calling for the shortage of human resources, I have heard that the self-defense forces in Japan have not been able to secure and develop human resources due to the lack of funds in addition to human resources. Moreover, I think it is quite difficult to prepare favorable treatment compared to other companies. As Ms. Simon pointed out, I think it is possible to develop human resources within the organizations at low cost. But do you have any other advice or ideas regarding human resource development specific to the military or self-defense forces in Japan?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the challenges when it comes to kind of developing human resources, and this is something that the US military does quite well, is that those are types of organizations that actually kind of have the luxury to build out large scale schoolhouses, if you will, to develop cyber talent. And so without knowing much about how the self-defense forces in Japan are structured, I think one of the kind of things that could be a takeaway based on how the US government does it is, or the US military, is each service actually has its own cyber force and they develop their own training programs. And when I say training programs, in many cases, it's also a brick and mortar like schoolhouse where new recruits will be identified, brought into the service, and then trained up on a program that they actually develop. And that could be anywhere from 6 months to a year plus. So there's a very significant investment that the US military makes in training overall that I think helps a lot. But I also would say they are also, as they evolve, are working more and more with private sector partners too. And one of the other kind of advice I will say, and I think this is true for military, but also for private sector companies, is one of the advantages that we are seeing coming out of the COVID pandemic is the democratization of access to education and training resources. So when we think about the talent shortage, it's actually much more accessible, and there's a much more there's more ubiquity of cybersecurity education resources through even private sector vendors that we didn't have access to before because they just was too much in-person emphasis. And now we kind of can do a lot of that online overall. So I think that's one idea that I would certainly grasp, is how to leverage private sector partners to actually kind of help on that scaling and cost issue.
Thank you. Now I'd like to go to the second question. So what is the career path of US government employees engaged in cybersecurity? In Japan, there are many people who have experience in the cybersecurity department, but after that, they have experience in other fields and they are transferred once every 2 to 3 years.
Well, I'd say this is an area that the government is making significant strides on. It's part of the reason that they went through the initial exercise to develop the NICE framework, that National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. And so one of the nuances of, at least for the US government, is that each agency has a different approach to this. So it's not one nationalized response. It is, the Department of Veterans Affairs has invested heavily in creating career pathways for cybersecurity professionals, and individuals will stay within that role, and then they, through professional development, can self-select into those other roles, and there's a very clear-cut pathway for them. Department of Homeland Security, part of the reason that they've launched the cyber talent management system is to do the same type of thing, but at a much larger agency for a much larger workforce, and how can they track that over time? But that management system is specific to the Department of Homeland Security. It is not used by any other US government agency. So that's actually, I think, one of the things that we struggle with in the US is because of the nature of our system, it's pretty individualized based on the agency and kind of what they're accomplishing. But what I will say is the one nice thing that has happened across the US government is there's now a common classification. If you are in a cyber role, it's like you're in a job code for cyber, and then you're kind of looking for other roles that fit within that job code of cyber. So that allows you to kind of have a pathway, but still maintain that consistency.
That's great. You have that system, that kind of evolving door for the federal government to advance your careers in the cybersecurity field. So now we got the third question. So about compensation. So when the curriculum, as you mentioned, is implemented, it is necessary to present appropriate compensation to the carrier. And I feel that there is often no step-by-step compensation form in Japan at present. Can you give us some advice on the balance between rewards and curriculum?
Sure. And just to clarify, when you say there's no step-by-step compensation, meaning that when there's additional training that's not necessarily recognized by a compensation increase?
The question doesn't specify.
Okay. All right. Well, I will try and at least address the kind of balance of rewards and curriculum. This comes up a lot for us in the US because I know one of the hesitations, and this is true of the government as well as private sector, is a cultural hesitation to provide access to training, whether it's curriculum or actual spending money to send someone to training, because the idea is, well, the fear is I'm training an employee who will now be worth more in the market and will go work somewhere else. And so at the same time, individual candidates are actually looking to companies and the opportunities that they provide as far as training education as a incentive or reward that they're looking for to actually want to work at some of these places of employment. So I think when you balance the rewards and the compensation versus the curriculum, someone is always going to be able to make more, at least for us in the US, by looking and moving to another company as opposed to staying in-house. But when you have a program in place and you can tie a career path to get this training, and then that means you can go do this job, which opens doors to do something else, now you're not only tying into salary. It's not the only motivator for people within a company. You're showing them that there's a path for them, a future, and that there's a way that they can kind of contribute overall. And the reality is, especially in today's economy, knowing at least how it is in the United States, people don't work at companies or organizations for 20 years plus anymore. It's very rare. And so the difference for a company, especially in an area like cybersecurity, the difference between having someone for 3 or 4 years versus losing them after around 2 is significant. So it's worth that investment. So you have to play the game. You have to be willing to have some attrition because people will get more skills as you give them access to training and they might go somewhere else. But you also, if you give them a pathway, they might stay a year or 2 longer, and they often do, and you can extract more of that value from them in the interim.
Thank you. So so a couple of months ago, a senior military official on cybersecurity gave his remarks in a US Senate hearing. And then he got a question from US senators about compensations and competitions to hire good retain cybersecurity talents between the industry and the military. And he gave a really intriguing insight. So he said that yes, and the compensations are really important to keep our talents, but also the flexibility about how to work is very crucial to attract good talents. And when we usually talk about compensation, we usually focus only on the monetary aspects, and we do not talk so much about the flexibility and work and work-life balance. Thank you so much for your insights. Yeah. So Okay, so next question. Okay, so in Japan, the wages and treatment of many workers remain low. And I think it is difficult to give hospitality only to cybersecurity. Furthermore, I think that the gap with essential workers in the information industry will be an issue. Even in elementary school programming, there is not enough support for literacy and teaching just because the burden on teachers increases. Are there any fundamental measures against these issues?
Yeah, this is something on the elementary education side in the US we struggle with as well. And part of the reason for that for us is because we have 50 different states that have different programs and funding of how they actually deal with state curriculum. But I think, I'd say the fundamental measures on everything is everything comes down to education. And if you're going to educate a new future of workers who go into cybersecurity, then that means you need to also have people who are capable of teaching that, which is the teachers, which I think is, again, that's something we struggle with in the United States as well. So, there are no measures available. What I would point you to when I think about what the US is doing, and it's by no means a cure-all, is organizations like cyber.org, where they're offering at no cost access to curriculum and resources for teachers to actually use that to kind of help get them up to speed so they can teach these type of things in their own school systems. That's very self-selective. It's not across the board, but those are some of, I think, the only things we've been able to do to date to really make an impact.
Thank you. So, so the next question. So in the case of a private company, do you think it is necessary to understand the personality and family environment of a person in order to train cybersecurity personnel?
Yes and no. I think, what I will say anecdotally is I truly believe anyone can be a cybersecurity professional, especially when you think about the sheer diversity of types of roles. Not all cybersecurity roles are hyper technical roles. So, anyone who, if you can assess or determine that they have a passion and an interest in learning the material, then I think they can be a cybersecurity professional. So I think it's important to understand a candidate's personality to say, are they willing to learn and are they capable of learning? And if they have those two qualities, then I think that they would make a very good cybersecurity professional. What I will say, it's not on family environment, but what I will say anecdotally are things I have found in my career. Former journalists or even attorneys make great threat analysts because they're used to thinking about the conclusion first and then backing it up with all the evidence. And I have found that former forensic accountants have made really wonderful forensic cybersecurity analysts because they are very good at looking for patterns and anomalies in those patterns and therefore can do that in code base just as much as they could in a spreadsheet of numbers. So not quite family, but I do think it really comes down to passion and willingness to learn.
Thank you. I agree that the passion and eagerness to keep studying because cybersecurity and technologies are always evolving. And I actually encountered a mother of 5 who decided to de-study, to major in cybersecurity at an undergraduate school.
Wow.
And she finished it. And not only that, and she's now working as a cybersecurity professional.
Amazing, yeah.
So that's amazing. So she got support from the school and the new company, but nothing stopped her from running. And that's
Yeah.
really inspirational. Okay, so next question. So thank you so much for the so many questions. I'm really impressed with and the passions and the audience to study about cybersecurity. So the next question, so while we can take adequate measures for military and financial services, we do not have enough funds for basic services and human resources for healthcare, social security, education, and other areas. And cybersecurity is difficult to even think about. How can this be addressed?
Yeah, always a very difficult challenge because financial services and the military are often the two big mission areas that everyone focuses on. And then the other areas get a little bit of short shrift as a result. I think one of the ways that can be addressed is part of the reason I think that the public-private partnerships are so compelling is because it's bringing together government agencies across healthcare and social security, beyond those agencies, and the candidates are essentially divvied out, and the agencies kind of make a determination so that they're willing to share the resources to actually do that. But on the second piece, in some of those areas where it's not government-led or it's education or healthcare, I think one of the other major areas is kind of around the marketing and the sharing of ideas and how do you share information about cybersecurity to make do with less resources that you have within those sectors. So I think in the United States, we have information sharing groups that different sectors have, like the auto industry has a cybersecurity information sharing center. The healthcare has an information sharing analysis center. And, companies and agencies of all sizes come together to sort of share best practices, share information, and those essentially become working groups to help rise the tides of the boats in all of those industries. So it's certainly, I think, an area. I know that in the US, in those sectors, it is like healthcare, as an example, has historically in the United States been behind in having a robust cybersecurity talent pool. In fact, they've been behind in really implementing cybersecurity controls like financial services or the military has. And the unfortunate reality for us in the US is that the increase in ransomware in the last year and a half has kind of spurred them to action, and now they're making those investments. But I would not recommend waiting for those tragedies to occur before doing it.
Thank you. So Japan actually has the ISAC, so information sharing center and analysis. And Japan also has an OTS ISAC as the equivalent to American version of OTS ISAC. And some of the major Japanese auto manufacturers that are members of the US version of OTS ISAC.
Oh, very cool.
And we also have the healthcare ISAC in Japan as well. So the next question. So although military and financial measures can be taken, there is not enough funds for basic services.
That's what we just.
Oh, we already did. So asking the background of cybersecurity personnel, such as their personality and family environment, risks promoting prejudice and discrimination. But how do you avoid it?
Yeah. So in the US, we have very strict laws about things that you can ask and not ask. And so you can't directly ask about family situation. Personality, I'd say, is the biggest area that we screen for. And the way that generally we ask is scenario based. That's often my recommendation when you're trying to either screen for aptitude or interest, to say, explain to me when you've done something, that you've learned something technical and you didn't know anything about it. What did you do? How did you actually approach that problem? So you ask the questions not in a direct way around their personality traits or their family, but you're asking, a question in a way to say, I want to understand how your brain thinks, and are you capable of, even if it's not related to security, can you actually tell me how you kind of tackled something you were unfamiliar with? And how did you learn that skill? And depending on the answer, you can usually pretty easily discern whether they were willing to kind of put in the work on their own. And that, I think that's more revealing about their personality than asking it directly.
Yes, thank you for your advice on how to understand the candidates and also to how to avoid the trouble. So unfortunately, I don't think we can manage to get through all of the questions, but I'm really grateful for the passions of the audience to understand this problem. So I'd like to over to you, Mr. Gonzalez, for the closing remarks.
Thank you both so very much. The presentation was absolutely fascinating, and the conversation was really engaging, as you can tell by, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get all of the questions, but that's always an indication of how good the conversation is going. So thank you both very much. And I also wanted to thank the audience for joining us here today. Before we end today's program, we would like to invite you to take a brief survey. Please see the QR code on your screen and scan it so that you could answer our survey questions. We would really appreciate it. While folks are doing that, Simone, is there any last words that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. I appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to listen to some of the things that I've learned in my experience. Certainly, I am a bit, if anyone wants to reach out, I can take some additional questions via email. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish everyone the best of luck and appreciate how much interest there is in growing cybersecurity talent. It really is the future here.
Thank you very much for those wise words. So I'd like to thank you once again, Simone, for participating in today's event and sharing your expertise with us here in Japan. And thank you, Matsubara-san, very much for your expert moderation. Also, I'd like to give a special thank you to our simultaneous interpreters and technicians at NHK and our captioners at UD Talk. Lastly, I'd like to invite you, the audience, to visit our website or our social media pages for further information about upcoming cybersecurity events and programs. We hope to see you at one of those. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, or your evening in the case of Simone.